Matt, really nice to see you this morning. It's great. Thank you very much for sort of saying you'd be willing to have a chat. We've only spoken the once, but what I really liked about our conversation last time was actually how you clearly have a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience of doing inner work, of working with meditation and that sort of thing. And we might even talk about some of your therapy work that you do as well for people. But what I'm really interested in, what really grabbed my attention when we spoke last time, was that you mentioned Zen. Now, I'm ignorant really of what Zen as a process is. I'm aware of the book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. So actually what I'd love is for us to talk about a little bit about this and about the inner work that you've done, and how it's benefited you and how it could perhaps benefit other people. So Matt, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do for a living, how you help people, that sort of thing?
Okay, well, yes, thank you, Tim. I work as a hypnotherapist, which is a very long way from where I started off. I was always very interested in hearing, actually, things work, which has helped me very much. I finally worked out how I work. I did a degree in engineering at University College, and then worked in software for a while, robotics actually. And then we got into financial software and worked for Lehman Brothers. And I was I worked in equity derivatives for Lehman Brothers for quite a while, and then stopped doing that before they went bust. So, and the stress of working there was something to do with where I've ended up. So my first encounter with meditation was sitting on the trading desk at Lehman Brothers, Googling meditation and discovering a place in Bethnal Green. So that's how my first contact with meditation, though strangely enough, I did read the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance when I was 16. So it's kind of come round.
So when were you working at Lehman Brothers then? What sort of era was that then? Because I can't remember when they went bust.
2008 was when they went bust. I worked for them from 1997 to 2004.
Would you say that was a highly stressed environment?
Yes, definitely. I was definitely stressed.
And was that mainly stress from because obviously stress is something that we bring on ourselves internally. So there are usually issues that create the stress, which is fear of doing things wrong, I suppose, and fear of not fitting in and all that sort of thing. Do you think that that's, I mean, without getting too personal, because I understand that you might not want to share that sort of stuff, but do you think those are the sort of things that were your triggers?
Yes, under doing things wrong, definitely. You have to be pretty driven to be there in the first place. So if you're not meeting those drives, then that's a fear. And you're sitting in a room with 200 other people. So yes, yeah, it's enough for most people.
Yeah, I have to say, you've just basically described my worst nightmare. So I completely understand where you are at. And so you made a realization that you had to change something, but you'd had some experience of the idea that meditation might be able to help you before this point?
I'm not sure, actually, no, because I hadn't meditated before then. I'd had a passing acquaintance with Buddhism, and I'd read a couple of books on Zen and not really made a connection with meditation.
Right. And you've ended up using this sort of inner work. These now in the present, you're using that and helping other people with this sort of expertise, aren't you? Tell us a little bit about what you do as a hypnotherapist, because obviously people have very set ideas about that sort of thing. Yes.
Well, the basic thing that a hypnotherapist does is use trance in one way. There's the image of putting someone in a trance with a gold coin, which is not very realistic. So that would be putting someone into a relaxation trance, which is a way of letting them slow down and access memories and things. But also every problem that they come form of trance. So whenever we're captivated into a self-sustaining state, that's a form of trance as well. So anxiety is a trance, depression is a trance. Every problem that people come to me with is a trance, because if they're not in a trance, if they're in a completely open, aware state, then there isn't a problem. So there's something going on in them that is circular, that is preventing them being relaxed and aware with open senses and free to act and enjoy the world.
So basically what you're talking about there is obviously a mental inner state where we think about almost everything except for the now, as they say. So our minds could be worrying about something in the future or reflecting on something in the past. I mean, so do people do that like far more than perhaps they're aware of? Is that true?
Well, I mean, you can't generalize about everyone, but yeah, people go into trances quite a lot. So when people talk about doing things on autopilot, then they're in the trance. So yes, and some I mean, some of the things it's not quite the same as, say, riding a bicycle where you've learnt to do it autonomously, but that's a beneficial autonomous behavior. But a trance is a non-beneficial autonomous behavior.
Right. So something that isn't aiding the well-being of the individual.
That's right, yes.
Right. Okay. It's really, so see, this idea of trance and the fact that we can, all of us, be inclined to go into those non-beneficial states is a really interesting, to use the word trance in that sense. So how do you help people out of that circumstance?
Well, you mentioned that trance is a mental thing. It's not just a mental thing. It's a physical thing as well. So in order for a trance to exist, there has to be a physical component and a mental component. And one of the aspects of the physical component is always tension. So getting someone to relax through breathing, through being with them, through telling them they're safe, that helps them relax. And then once you've helped them start to relax, then you can start talking with them about their interpretation of what's happening. And their interpretation of what's happening is the mental, if you like, part of the trance. So you start taking it apart. There's a circularity of the physical and mental response that is necessary for the trance to sustain itself. And if you start asking people to change bits of it voluntarily, then for one, they realize that they have got control over these things that were just happening on their own. And that tends to break the trance in itself. But there can often be strong interpretations. That's certainly where the trance is the result of an early traumatic experience in life. There can be misinterpretation, very marked misinterpretation of the experience, because it very often happens as a child. And there's a sense of completely unrealistic responsibility, for example, or it was their fault. And when you get into looking at the experience in detail with the client, they can usually pretty easily see that, well, that's not realistic. So a component of the trance can be self-blame very often.
Right, which is where the trauma comes from.
Yes, well, the trauma would be I mean, there's physical trauma, which is organic, and there is subjective trauma, which is psychological, if you like, but it's not, anything psychological is not permanent. We have neuroplasticity, which enables us to relearn things.
And that applies
so
no matter.
We can always.
Sorry.
Yeah, it doesn't matter how much. I mean, people can have traumatic births, for example, and that can affect them through their life. And even that you can change.
I believe they found that actually neuroplasticity, so the adaptability of the brain to form new neurons and new processes and new thinking patterns, actually will continue no matter how old the person is, which goes against traditional thinking, as far as I'm aware.
Yes, that seems a bit strange, because we've always accepted that there's a power to learn. So there seems to be a contradiction there, possibly. But if you can keep on learning, then you can keep on adapting.
Yeah, because you can learn new behaviors and new ways of self-well-being. And so pulling it back round to your training or your own self-learning, the magic word Zen was mentioned. What is Zen? Is it always associated with Zen Buddhism, or is it a separate sort of process?
Well, I believe the word Zen comes from the Chinese word Chan, which I believe also is a synonym for samadhi from Sanskrit or Indian. That describes a state where one is balanced and open, and in intimate receptivity to the world. And there's an analogy in Zen of being a mirror of the world. So you're not adding anything. You are being yourself as an organism, and you're in your environment, the world, and you're relaxed, and you're taking it in, and you're acting naturally. So for me, that is Zen. There are lots. I mean, I think there's a stylistic view of what Zen is, which doesn't bother me very much. There's a body of historical literature which is also Zen, and there are traditions, but those traditions are really there to support the practice of sitting in Zazen, which is a practice to allow you to regain this state of balance, samadhi, which we had, because when we were toddlers, that's what we had.
Excellent. And so what that says to me is that most of our adopted behaviors that are less than enforcing a state of well-being, because they are putting us out of balance, tend to be processes that actually are fighting against that ability to accept and know the self. Does that make sense? Do you feel that that's the case?
Yes, but it does sound rather strange, doesn't it? That we can develop behaviours which fight against the self, and they're really confused behaviours. So we can pick up lots of things in our life, and certainly when we're young, we're taught lots of things, and not all of them are true. So there's certainly a very strong tendency to pick up whatever our parents or teachers or peers say to us, without even thinking about questioning it. So we can pick up behaviours like that are I mean, behaviours and ideas, I'm not distinguishing between those two really, because ideas lead to behaviours. Yeah, we can pick those up and they end up not being helpful.
I'm thinking that you're a master of understatement for some people. Obviously, accepting that everybody is an individual. To say that some of the behaviours that we can pick up are not helpful, I think, is a masterful understatement. To the degree that some people, become quite self-destructive. But I think all of us. Well, I know that I have gone through decades of self-sabotaging behaviour. And actually, it's only in starting to accept who I am in that process of sort of self-analysis and in my own little way that actually I've recognized those processes of self-destructive behavior. And therefore you can do something about it. And that's the key, isn't it, really, in all of this, which is really what you're saying, is to be able to help an individual step outside of their behaviors and be observant of their behaviors. Is that correct?
Yes, it's being able to understand what's happening and doing it without criticism or judgment, because the way that ideas and behaviors, I mean, they're very often ideas of self. So let's mention the word self straight up, really. That we think we're bad, we think we're inadequate, we think we're that there's something wrong, and that's not the case. We're human beings living in a world that's sometimes easier and sometimes more difficult, but we're natural to this world, and any sort of criticism that we have of ourselves is not warranted. Yes, we may do things that we don't like, and we may do things that are not helpful to ourselves and other people, but we can also relax about that a bit and start looking at what do we think that is making that happen. Certainly inquiring as to what we believe and whether it's true, and that happens through the process of sitting zazen. It's not widely talked about, but it does happen naturally. And the importance of ideas decreases. So whichever way you, there are lots of ways that you can work through limitations and unhappiness with yourself, and they all end up in the same place, really. So Zen is a particular one that certain people have an affinity to.
So really what you're saying is that the process of any meditation, any form of meditation, will assist an individual to naturally develop that objective view of self. Is that really what you're saying?
I think that's too strong a statement. I mean, okay. I've heard that people have benefited greatly from transcendental meditation, for example. There are Hindu forms of meditation that I think are that do that. There are practices which are not meditation, like emotional freedom technique, tapping, which leads to that. Doing mindfulness meditation without any inquiry, I think, does not lead to that. I think mindfulness on its own is a way of calming yourself down while you're while and for a period after doing the practice, but without any sort of self-inquiry, it's not going to produce a permanent change. So at least that's my experience of it.
I think that's a really very interesting viewpoint. I would go along with that. I think that's probably very true. And really, with that, what you're really saying is the process of self-inquiry is to simply ask why.
Yeah, why or what's happening. So this crosses over very much with the hypnotherapeutic area, because if you ask yourself why, you're asking your unconscious, presumably. So you're asking the part of your the bigger part of your mind, what's happening, and it will answer. And you're crossing also over with prayer. So you could be asking the universe or God, what's happening? Or you could be asking, I don't want this. Or asking for peace, or asking for happiness. And whether you're asking your unconscious, whether you're asking God or the universe, there's a lot of evidence that this works. So you should pick something that is known to work and do it. I mean, it does matter how you do it. So you need to do it right. You need to do it so that you're not implicitly criticizing and putting yourself down. So there are ways, and that they're quite widely talked about these days on the internet about how to do this.
Do you think it is something that people can do on their own, or do you think it is advisable to be assisted in that process of self-evaluation and the healing process, which is what you're describing?
I think it's always advisable, if you want to learn something, to learn it from someone who does it. It's possible to do it from books, I suppose. It's a bit confusing because you may not see the wood for the trees, and it may take you a long time. So certainly the best way is to ask somebody who does it.
And I guess one of the things that you would be very conscious of is how individual every single person is that comes to you. Is that true? Is there an observation that you can make there that you share with us in terms of just what it's like, what it means to be a human being? Because we're so unique.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are patterns with things. I mean, imagine all the different things you can think about yourself, or imagine the sorts of things that the people that you know think about themselves. So there are some fairly common views. So I'm not good enough. I mean, what is enough? The question or the statement doesn't make sense. But people will accept it as gospel truth, and they will organize their lives around it and what they do around a statement that is nonsensical. So yes, I mean that's a pretty big one, actually, and the problem is that we have cultural influences as well, and we're all subjected to cultural influences, and that one, am I good enough, is ingrained in our culture, and it makes much sense. We're human beings. I'm trying to think of the word. There's a word used by Carl Rogers, I think, which is we are developing. We're learning. We're growing. We're living, and we know how to do this. We've got everything that we need to do this. And when we hear a story that tells us that we can't do this, then we can disbelieve it, because we've evolved to be able to do this.
Do you think, given that children are so susceptible to taking on stories that they then tell themselves and effectively live for decades from what is potentially a false understanding of the world or themselves, which is really what we were saying, what we're discussing. Mm-hmm. Do you not think that that is part of the process of evolution, and there's a reason why we are built like that in terms of psychology, that there is a facet to humanity that requires this unveiling of the truth as you get older?
Well, yes, I think it's inherently bound up to do with the fact that we use language, and in order for language to be useful, we also have to have a faculty of imagination. Can't have a communication using language without the recipient being able to imagine. And before the development of language, creatures didn't do that. They interacted only with their environment through their sensory apparatus. And our sensory apparatus has adapted to be not only an instrument of perception, but also an instrument of reconstruction, of imagination. So, and somewhere in that process, we've lost, or we never created the ability to necessarily distinguish between something that is a real experience and something that is a story. So we can believe things that are not that we haven't directly experienced. I mean, we live in a concrete reality. So there are concrete objects that we interact with, and in Zen terms, those are things like walls, mountains, and rivers. Is used a lot in Zen. And Dogen, who is the founder of Soto Zen, says that walls, mountains, and rivers teach us a lot. So I think what he's pointing to there is that there is concrete reality, and yet we have another thing that we think of as reality. We have an abstract reality. We have thousands of terms and concepts that we use that we can't point to, but we believe in them, such as justice, for example. So I can have a client who comes to me and says that wasn't fair. And if I can help them see that doesn't mean anything, then that automatically means they're not a victim. And if they're not a victim, they don't feel bad.
Wonderful.
So the inability for us to, I mean, this is quite difficult, really. It's not something that's as straightforward, because our lives are constructed out of what we think of ourselves and other people, and it's a huge mixture of what is real and what is, well, I'm not saying it's not real, but it's a convention that we believe, and to believe it less means that you don't have to worry about it as much. So that's also something that Zen practice does. You're sitting there for hours and hours looking at a wall, and you've dedicated yourself to it. And all of your abstract concepts come up and assail you sooner or later and tell you that you're wasting your time. but you're not, actually. You're actually being very real. You're interacting and proving your reality in the very simplest way, which is to just be sitting there. And that grates with our abstractive part.
Would you say, see, what you've done there is really, really interesting, and I love the way, Matt, that you're actually able to take these what are very complex subjects and approaches and actually explain them with a comparative simplicity, which is absolutely lovely. And what you've just done there is to cover off a point that I was thinking about earlier on, which was when we were talking about the process of self-evaluation is to ask the question why. And then at that point, we talked about a process that was quite cerebral and quite intellectualized, quite mind orientated. But what you've just balanced it with is exactly the opposite, which is to sit and just be in the physical body, which is actually more aware in that sense than all of the questioning. But it's the combination of the two that actually provides the balance or the healing, I suppose. Is that's broadly what you've covered this morning, I suppose, isn't it?
Well, I do think that's very important and true, yes, that a purely cerebral activity doesn't change things. I mean, that's broadly what I would call philosophy, which can have helpful aspects. And there have been some philosophers like Spinoza who was very much embodied. And I can't really talk about more modern ones because I haven't studied it for a very long time. But practically speaking, what makes us act in our life is feeling. So we are motivated by feelings, whether we don't really think of it that way. We like to think that we have a good reason for doing everything, or at least I certainly did, but looking at it, it doesn't stand up. I mean, lots of my reasons were retrospective justifications. If you don't feel like doing something, you don't do it. If you feel like doing it, you do. So without dealing with that aspect, without dealing with your body, with your visceral emotive responses, then you can't find balance. And this is something out of Buddhist tradition as well, because originally the Buddha studied with ascetics who practiced a form of meditation, which was a form of the withdrawal. There are forms of meditation where you're very inward focused and achieving things called dhyanas, which again also means samadhi, but a different kind. And with those, you can get to incredible states of peace, but you're not connected. You're not involved. Your senses are shut down. So you can get to very extreme states, and the serenity can persist for a while after you come out of them, but it eventually fades. So that's basically you can be very calm by withdrawing from reality. But if you want to be balanced and still be in reality in your life, then you have to include the body. And that's what yoga's about. Alexander technique. These are all ways. I mean, yoga sutras. Yoga has a very strong tradition. It's not all genuine or practiced authentically these days, but yes, yoga is a union with reality. And the physical practices of yoga and breathing techniques after that are on that route.
I had never realized that yoga in its true form was about unity with creation, effectively. That's lovely. It's a beautiful expression. So that's terrific. I mean, we'll start to draw this to a close because it's been fascinating, Matt. I wish our internet connection had been a little bit stronger, but maybe if we talk again in the future, then perhaps it will be. You've got some really interesting concepts, and I'm sure that what we've discussed, what you've shared with us today, will be of interest to those watching. I mean, I hope it will be, because I think it's valuable stuff. Just tell us a little bit about how if people want to work with you, how can they find you?
They can find me and also my wife Angela, who's a similar meditator for 20 years, at londonholisticpractice.co.uk, and we do holistic counselling, emotional freedom technique, and hypnotherapy. And if you want to do meditation, well, there's londonzen.org is the Dogen Sangha London group. And there are Dogen Sangha groups around the UK, which is a genuine Zen group.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Matt. It's been
Well,
really,
thank you, Sim.
really interesting.